Yeah, we're live.
Hey, well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, from wherever you are. Welcome to our Tuesday Universal Peace Federation webinar series. Today's program is hosted by the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, one of the 8 associations under the UPF umbrella. And my name is Alan Jess, and I'm happy to be your host and moderator for today. And for the sake of our new guests who may be joining us, UPF was co-founded in 2005 by the late Reverend Sumya Moon and his wife, Dr. Hakjahan Moon, and is a 501c3 NGO with general consultative status with United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. We're an international and interreligious network of individuals and organizations, including representatives from religion, government, civil society, and the private sector. And we're dedicated to achieving world peace on the foundation of mutual prosperity, interdependence, and universal shared values. And specifically to our mission at IAED is to attract and develop a core of business, government, innovative, economic thought leaders who can collectively impact society through collaboration, education, and deepened relationships that lead to the creation of a global environment conducive to mutual prosperity and peace. And in that regard, today's speaker is a highly acclaimed thought leader and expert from the public policy sector who will speak on the topic welfare reform. Where do we go from here? As a bit of background, I met Professor Mead last summer at a Braver Angels convention. And for those of you who don't know, Braver Angels is really a movement across the country to lessen the polarization in our society where people leaning red or leaning blue can come together in educational forums to discuss issues while learning to listen and understand viewpoints on the other side. Professor Mead speaks honestly on what are often contentious issues, but he does that with that spirit in mind. So I'd like to remind everyone before we begin that today's program is being streamed live and will be recorded and available in our IAED archives of past programs at us.upf.org. And I'm looking forward to a robust discussion here today. You can put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them if we can. So with all that being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker and then turn the program over to him. So Professor Lawrence M. Mead is the professor of politics and public policy at New York University. He has previously been a visiting professor at Harvard, Princeton, and the University of Wisconsin. He's also twice been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He is the author of 13 books on poverty, welfare, and related issues in the United States and other rich countries. Among academics, he was the principal theorist behind the epic welfare reform of 1996, which for the first time clearly required welfare mothers to work as a condition of aid. And just a reminder, that was the welfare reform negotiated between Newt Gingrich and President Bill Clinton, 1996. He is also a leading scholar of the politics and implementation of welfare reform and, significantly, of work programs for men. His many publications on these subjects have helped shape social policy in the United States and abroad. So welcome, Professor Mead. The floor is yours.
Okay, let me see if I can get my PowerPoint on the screen here. I think this is right. Not sure. Okay, let's try it. Okay.
It's coming, yes.
All right.
Very good.
Okay. Let me see if I can get this. Yeah. Okay. Well, Paul, thanks very much for this opportunity to speak. I will briefly describe the welfare reform of 96 and go on to 2 other issues, which it seems to me have become more pressing since then. As a first thought, let me see if we can get this. We have to get the your screen sharing. Stop share. I have to get
No, you don't want to stop share, just to move the slides.
Okay. I want the slide on the screen.
We
Let's
lost
try that.
the slides.
Yeah. Okay. I think let me see if that's working. Yes, it is. Okay, good.
No, you need to share. You lost the sharing.
Yeah. Wait a minute. I
Professor.
see what happened. Hold on. Let me try again.
So share the screen and slides and then click, I guess.
Now I have that problem of having that.
Maybe your down arrow would work.
I don't want this thing up here. See, let me see if it'll. No, see now it won't go to the next slide. You are screen sharing. Stop share.
You need to change the focus to your presentation.
This.
Roger, do you have any suggestions?
Try clicking or using the arrow key on your keyboard to advance the slide.
Yes, I am trying that and not getting anywhere.
Oh, you need to click on the slide first.
Let me try again here. Wait a minute.
Just click on the slide.
See, now it doesn't move. Doesn't go to the next slide.
Can you try pressing the enter key, Professor?
What's that?
The enter key on your keyboard.
Enter key.
No.
May I say something?
Enter key does nothing.
Dear Professor, you need to change the focus of your keyboard on your presentation. With Alt-Tab, you can switch the focus between the windows.
Okay, you'll have to say that more clearly.
Alt-Tab tabular. If you push the Alt.
Push the what?
Alt key and
Out?
Tab. Alt, alternative, Alt. Alt and tabular. And you can, with tabular, you can switch between active windows.
I don't understand what you're saying. I'm sorry, I don't understand it. It's accent, it's not volume. I hear you, but I don't understand your words.
Do you know which keys I mean? Alt and tabular.
I'll try to get one. Let me see.
Because after sharing, the focus is on the zoom. I need to change the focus on exactly. You need to change the focus again back to the presentation.
Okay, I don't know I cannot understand your language. I'm sorry.
Yeah, do you have Windows? Do you have Windows or?
I have Windows.
Try the Alt key on the bottom left of your keyboard.
Chat.
And the Alt key.
I think I'll tell them to talk. Professor Mead, maybe you can just go through your presentation. There it is.
All right, I'm not sure what I did.
Well, we see the summary now.
Okay, it is working. Okay, let's go with what we.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, the summary is we're going to go over welfare and the controversies, and then we're going to go on to the further challenges involving cultural difference and immigration. Now, the welfare system is essentially, or was then, and still is, a federal state cash aid program for poor families, first established in the 30s with the name Aid to Families with Dependent Children. States varied in generosity of the grants they gave to families, with richer states paying higher benefits than poorer. The federal government, however, reimbursed the states for the costs, the rates varying inversely with state wealth. So a rich state like New York and California gets half the cost back from Washington, and poorer states get more. So that's the basic idea. Now, the controversy in welfare, going back to the 60s, was whether the welfare mothers, the adults on welfare, should have to work in return for aid. This is not the only issue that one might have argued about in welfare. There are actually a number of others, but this is the one that came to dominate the discourse. Few welfare mothers work. Conservatives believed that requiring them to work would actually make fewer of them dependent. They'd be able to support themselves. Liberals, however, opposed any idea of work requirements as inhumane. They thought any family poor enough to need aid should get it as a matter of right and should not have to do anything in return. Polls, however, showed then and now that the public strongly favors work requirements in welfare. The public does not object to helping the needy. On the contrary, and there's no issue about the cost. These are not the important issues in welfare. The big issue is work. Should the recipients have to work to support themselves, even if they also get aid? On this matter in the 80s and 90s, the experts were divided. There was a growing movement in favor of work requirements, but Congress was controlled by Democrats, and as a result, nothing much changed. However, in 1994, the Republicans won control of Congress for the first time in 40 years, and they generated a much more radical welfare system. They forced through Congress something called the Personal Responsibility Act, and Bill Clinton, as president, signed it. This was because Clinton himself had run for president on a promise to end welfare as we know it. And this proposal was much more radical than his own plan, but he nevertheless accepted it. The main point of the act was to force the states to move at least half of their welfare adults into work activities within a few years, much greater than had ever been required before. And the effects were surprisingly positive. Within a few years, most of the caseload, about 2/3, had left the rolls, and most of the leavers went to work. And there was a big increase in employment and a reduction in poverty. And surprisingly, and there was some doubt about this, there was very little hardship for families and children. The belief had been that if there were no guaranteed aid without work, then children would be abandoned. But this never happened. So the outcome of the act was not only a big success for welfare policy, but also a general, large defeat for the way the left had viewed poverty going back decades. Now, but the controversy is not over, because since that time, Congress has moved to the left on the welfare questions, and now there is no support in Congress for doing anything to increase or change work requirements in any welfare program. And indeed what the left now favors, and also most academics, is a form of guaranteed income where a credit given for children would be given to the families even without employment. So even if they earned nothing and had no need for a tax credit, they would nonetheless get the benefit. And this resembles the kind of guaranteed income that many European countries had until very recently. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the welfare controversy, and it's still alive today. I heard just the other day that there are serious proposals in the House to increase the child tax credit and go back to a version of it that would be guaranteed and would not require a work test. Now, but after that, there are two further issues which it seems to me are closely connected to the welfare question, which we want to talk about. The most important of these is what I call a cultural difference. A cultural difference refers to the fact that of the groups that are heavily in poverty and on welfare, there's large differences between most of them and mainstream society. The American culture in general is a strongly individualist one, in which most individuals seek personal goals, but also are moralistic about good behavior. Yeah, here we are. So it's these people, individualist, assertive, but moralistic, that created the America we have. And most of these people came from Europe, and especially from Western Europe, England, Germany, the Netherlands. These are the people that defined the culture we have today. But the seriously poor mostly come from non-Western countries where the culture is very different. In most of the non-West, the attitudes are more not really to assert oneself and seek to get ahead, but rather to survive adversity and to adjust to outside necessity. And the moral structure is different. It's based primarily on social conventions and pressure from other people, rather than the moralistic principles found in Western culture. And the result is that people who come from these other countries, especially Latin America, Asia, Africa, all these societies lack the individualist culture that America had from the beginning, and which was preserved in the the immigration of the past up through 1960. But after that, you get a dramatic change. Now, it's important to note, however, that these cultural differences have nothing to do inherently with race. There's an attitude that minorities are to be seen as distinct racially, And although that's true, it's irrelevant to the way life is lived. Actually, what counts is how people are socialized as children, what they regard as normal culture. So culture is not a euphemism for race. In fact, it has nothing inherently to do with race at all. And in America, many racial minorities have actually assimilated to the individualist culture more than they would have done if they weren't in America. But anyway, the poverty question is closely tied to culture because the heavily poor, those who are in poor long term, tend to come from the non-Western world, and they have the attitudes, a passive conformist view of life, which makes it hard for them to progress in a society which is competitive and free. In fact, their main problem is coping with freedom rather than with oppression. And so to overcome poverty, one really has to promote assimilation into the mainstream culture. That's been my main recommendation pretty much all along. And that is what finally happens when welfare programs, and not really welfare, but other anti-poverty programs, are effective in promoting assimilation. But welfare reform in itself did not produce this. Welfare reform was primarily about changing the arrangements for subsidizing the very poor and especially promoting employment. But that by itself did not produce a change towards an individualist culture. That was the great limitation, in fact, of the reform. Now, alongside this, starting actually in about 1965, you have a massive increase in immigration coming from these non-Western countries, chiefly from Asia and Latin America. And that has vastly increased the number of people in the society who encounter serious social problems. And it's related to what I was just mentioning about cultural difference. What we find now is that people, chiefly from Latin America and even Asia, as I'll say in a moment, are having problems dealing with a free society that is also competitive. Migrants have a difficulty adjusting to the idea that they have to decide what they want and go after it. And they also have to think of right and wrong as matters of general principles rather than social conventions. And because of that shift, it's now very difficult to overcome entrenched poverty because it also involves a culture very, very different from mainstream America. This culture is found especially among Blacks, not all Blacks, because there is also a middle class that has emerged in Black society. And those Blacks are just like individualist people who came from Europe. They have a very similar view of the world, and they are getting ahead. But the massive Blacks, about 2/3, are the heirs of slavery going back to the 19th century and before, and their way of life is still a matter of survival rather than getting ahead, and they have serious social problems. Hispanics have very similar problems, even though they were not enslaved. And so what's really at issue here is a way of life that simply doesn't fit most of America. Now, many people, when I say this, they say immediately, well, what about Asians that are doing very well in America? And they are doing well in the sense that they do well getting through school. But after that, they have significant problems because after school, especially after college, the assumption is in America that you have to decide what you want to do, and you have to dedicate your life to a series of goals. And for that, Asians are very cautious. They, in fact, are used to deferring to authority. In college, they ask to be told what to think rather than thinking for themselves. And after they leave school, they're reluctant to take risks and get out in front and do something new. So the toleration for dynamism, for innovation, is altogether less than for the groups that came from Europe. So Asians are not as successful as they often seem. Here's a study that was published it was actually from the Harvard Business School that shows how various groups succeed in terms of becoming chief executives in the business world. What shows here is that the East Asians are the ones that we typically think of when we think of Asian, particularly Chinese and other people from that part of Asia. However, South Asia, meaning primarily India and Pakistan, do rather well. And the reason is those immigrants, if they come to the US at all, are coming from a highly Anglified education system in their home countries. So they've already adjusted to the individualist culture, and they're doing just fine. And whites, of course, are the origin of that culture, and they're doing okay. So the great problem actually is the Asians that we think of as so successful. And I've found, and many other professors have found, it quite difficult to teach this group because of their inability to think for themselves. They have to change and become more open to new possibilities, as well as they have to be more inner-driven, in fact. That is the main change. And this shows you the shifting shares of various groups within the population. And Hispanics, you see, are growing sharply. They are now, or soon will be, a quarter of the population. Asians are also growing. Blacks are not growing because they're not involved in much immigration. And whites are declining. They are now going to be less than half the population. So the concern culturally is that the culture that has driven America towards dynamism, wealth, power, and world leadership, that culture, which came from Europe, is now going to be coming from a much smaller part of the population than it was traditionally. So this is why, although immigration can be a good idea in certain ways, it nevertheless poses a threat to the dominant culture of the country. So that's the thing. That's the reason why the welfare question today is connected to these other issues about cultural difference and immigration. So that's pretty much what I want to. Oh, and let's talk about what the solutions imply. Well, the programs that have been successful in reducing poverty and, most importantly, also promoting cultural change tend to be programs that are highly directed, where they have a staff that promotes a way of life characteristic of the West as a whole, rather than just reducing poverty. And the reason that they have to do that is that the young people who come into these programs are usually coming from single-parent families where they have not, in fact, learned the basic culture in childhood. And they have to be taught it over again. In a sense, what these directive programs do is reparent the child. And I'm now finishing a book with some co-authors where we look at various types of programs, and we find that the most effective are those that, in fact, do promote cultural change. So that can happen. And the culture is not cast in concrete. And again, it has nothing to do inherently with race, and it's possible to change. But it takes time, takes several generations, and there has to be a commitment to doing this on the part of the mainstream population. And the other great necessity is that immigration should be cut. The rates that we've recently had, particularly under President Biden, were essentially an open border. Anybody could come to America regardless of their background, and that has produced a serious crisis in the big cities. Immigrants and blacks together have now dominate all the big cities, and the schools have become really a receiving operation where they've really given up promoting the immigration, the assimilation that we should wish. So immigration should be cut, and the anti-poverty apparatus ought to be shifted towards cultural change. So that is my conclusions. And at this point, you're probably outraged, and I'll get your comments in a moment. Here is the basis for what I've been saying. The first book here, Beyond Entitlement, is the book I wrote that basically made the argument for work enforcement as part of welfare reform. The cultural difference argument is later. That comes from a book called Burdens of Freedom, in which I go into this cultural difference and its implications for poverty and other issues. That, I think, is the most important book I've written, and it's in fact, it points to the really serious difference that America faces, not just in social policy, but in many other areas. The Western world is being invaded, indeed overcome, by immigration from the non-Western world. And much of those countries, the population of those countries are fleeing countries that are falling apart and striving any way they can to get to either Europe or the United States. It's understandable, and a response is called for, but we can't simply open the borders because this would in fact, destroy the societies we have. So that's the big issue we face. Okay, now comments, outrage, disagreement.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mead. Appreciate that. Very succinct and clear presentation. Now, I have a question.
Yeah.
If you would, you said directive anti-poverty programs. Can you mention a few of what you're talking about when you say directive anti-poverty programs? Because these are the programs that you're saying should be utilized for assimilation.
Yes, yes. Well, what I'm getting at is the difference between a program oriented to the need of the poor and responding to those needs, and a program that tries to change how they live. And both are necessary in the sense that there is a real need to help people who are destitute and don't have any way to live. Again, the public does not oppose welfare or the need to help the poor. That is a moral obligation in most of our religious backgrounds. We take that as a normal response to hardship, and it is indeed something we have to do. On the other hand, it doesn't by itself cause an integration in the society. And the tendency historically has been simply to give benefits to people that they need and simply assume that they're going to be the same as other people. But that has not proved true because, again, of these cultural differences coming from other countries. So we can't just take that for granted. We have to combine benefits with direction about how to live and how not do things to do and not do. And what the effective programs do is promote that. And the most conspicuous examples are probably the leading charter schools, which attempt to take over the education of poor children from the public system and are usually far more directive about what they expect of the children. And what they are in fact doing is reparenting the child. They are giving the child the early direction about how to live and not live, which they should have had in the cradle and typically didn't get because the families are disorganized and especially because most of the families are female-headed. And therefore, the father isn't around and there's much less attention paid to the child and how they need to function in the outside world. And that is the real limitation. Recent research has made it very clear that there is really no good way to make good the limitation of a single mother family. That really isn't possible. It's known that we can do something about it, and we have to, in a sense, take over the child rearing problem and move that to the school, which is able to do it more effectively. And that's what has been proved to be true in the most successful programs we have. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes effort. And one has to be patient with that. But you can't assume that everyone's the same. And even though this sounds invidious to say that we're fastening on people who are different, actually, it is quite possible with the right instruction to get people to adopt a different way of life. And that is what we're aiming at here.
So charter schools would be a successful anti-poverty program.
Some, not all of them. Charter schools, although on average they are somewhat better than the regular schools in terms of how much learning they produce, the true examples to follow are the most successful of these programs, and especially a couple of charter schools in the New York area. The most notable is the Success Academy produced by Eva Moskowitz, who has produced 40 high-performing schools in New York where most of the kids are disadvantaged, and yet they outperform the suburbs in their scores on state tests, which is miraculous. This is, in fact, the most impressive achievement we've ever accomplished in any poverty policy.
So if schools are being required to do some of the reparenting and child development for the cultural qualities that are needed to succeed in our culture, do you think that the efforts to reorganize the education department and there's a lot of different efforts in the states to open up education to more choice, would that be something that would be helpful?
The difficulty, and this is true for most of anti-poverty policy, the really serious problem is not primarily to get the concept right, although that is certainly part of the solution. It's to implement that, to create an administrative structure which plausibly makes clear to the poor themselves what is expected of them. See, the thing that's hard to persuade Americans of is that the answer is not freedom here. The assumption we make generally is that if anybody has troubles in America, they must be inhibited in some way, and we have to provide greater opportunity. Well, that may be sometimes true, but the problems we have today are primarily about with children who didn't receive proper instruction on how they ought to behave in the cradle. It's the lack of early instruction, especially the lack of bonding to the parents, that makes it impossible for these parents, for these children then to go on and succeed in school and later on in the workplace. We have to understand Freedom America style is not free. It depends upon a lot of internal discipline that we just take for granted. And certainly everyone on this podcast has probably, with few exceptions, gone through a family experience where they learned all this in the cradle and they know how to behave and not behave. And that is what allows them to function. So the phrase that I use is those who would be free in America must first be bound, and they must be bound typically in the cradle, very early in life. And if that isn't present, then you have to try to replace it by one of these more intensive programs.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions from Leslie Rigney, and then I want to move on to one of our commentators. But Leslie asks, first of all, does ADC still require a man to be absent in the household? That's one question.
Yes.
And then she's saying, is there any effort to enable single mothers to be trained and work in daycare programs?
On the first question, it's true that for as long as AFDC was in existence up to 96, it had a rule against the father being in the family and getting aid because the father was expected to work. And indeed, if the father worked, then the family wouldn't need aid in the first place. That was the assumption. But it's been found out that actually it doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether the father is in the welfare group or not. And there are even some advantages to that. So many states now, they have the option to cover the father if he is part of the family unit. But that doesn't mean that the mother is free to a work test. She still faces work. And in fact, the fathers typically, they are the reason why the family is on aid in the first place. So indeed, the long-term issue in welfare is really not work. It's the family structure. And you have to somehow get the father back in the family. And that's a subject that I'm thinking and writing about currently. And the second question you had was, remind me what it was about.
It was whether there's any effort to train mothers in daycare centers.
Yes, except that childcare staff typically are paid very little. And it's unlikely, although I'm sure there are mothers that become childcare helpers, that isn't likely by itself to get them off welfare or satisfy the work requirement. So yes and no, it's something that happens, but the jobs that welfare mothers take and have to take under the new rules are quite diverse and they involve a lot of different kinds of work.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. I've asked two individuals from our audience to come on and offer some brief comments and then a question of Professor Mead. So Dr. Gordon Anderson is author of the book Integral Society.
I was wondering if...
And he's been helping us at IAD work out the framework of what we call headwing economics. Professor Mead, kind of neither left nor right wing, right? Headwing economics. But if you'd please bring Dr. Anderson to the screen, I see here, he's here. Yeah. And go ahead and unmute yourself and share with us, Gordon.
So
all right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Mead, for your presentation, which I don't find controversial. I find it a straightforward presentation of the situation that we're in, and one worthy of a professor at New York University. I see many of the same problems that you see. I think we also, from my point of view, and Ellen mentioned I wrote this book, Integral Society, and the subtitle is Social Institutions and Individual Sovereignty. And I see much of the division in our society today as being a kind of a war between institutions and populism. And in reality, both have a role to play. I see the institutions as the ethical framework for our society, although they often get hijacked. And today, almost every one of them is hijacked. They are the ethical framework for our society. And then individuals on the right. So institutions I put on the left wing. And on the right wing, I put individuals who are moral agents. So individuals have moral agency. They have a conscience, they initiate action. Impersonal social institutions can't do this. They don't have a conscience. They're just made up of people. And they are a framework. And they can maybe be ethical, but they can't be moral. So an individual can raise a child, but an institution can't raise a child. Institution is only a framework within which for society. So I agree with you on the issue of immigration. I see that as one of the main differences. I think a lot of the immigrants that come from different cultures have in the past been willing to accept the need to change and adopt the American sort of cultural framework, but that the left has actually kind of destroyed this, and that the left wants to say every culture is just as valuable.
Yeah.
And I think every parent wants their child to succeed, but
Mr. Anderson, I'd like to interrupt you just for a minute, because Reverend Oliver invited him as well, and he's in a situation where he has to we'll get back to you to have a conversation if that's okay. So sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to give Reverend Oliver a chance to say hello. He's the president of the National Faith-Based Empowerment Coalition. He's also leading a task force on stopping the violence. So any thoughts you have, Reverend Oliver, to share with us?
Yeah, Dr. Anderson, I'm so sorry. I'm actually rushing because I have to renew my passport to travel in 2 days. And so I thought I would be home by now, or at the office, put my jacket on and talk to you guys. But now I have to sit in the car and then run back in before the place closes up and get parking. It's just wild. But I would just like to say that one thing that struck me in your comments today, and I am not for welfare. I think that welfare has caused a lot of problems within the minority community, especially the Black community. But I knew that there was a need for it at a certain juncture in history. And I think that there was not enough programs to wean the mothers off of being dependent on welfare. So what you did was you created a whole generation. One generation has been almost it became indicative within the DNA, culturally, creating a subculture, if you will. But there was a very crucial word that you used, and I think you were sharing that particular word in conjunction with a little bit where the welfare program started within the American society, who were Americans, Black Americans, African Americans, and then probably Latin Americans and Indian Americans. But you use the word assimilation, and I agree. But that was, I think, was just a little bit more connected with the immigrants who are coming over. They are coming from different cultures. However, I believe that Black Americans' assimilation process was not as conducive, if you will, for them, because of you used the word, we're coming out of slavery. We had to fight for our equal rights. We had to fight for who we are as Americans. And it still feel that we're not extremely accepted. And you said the individualistic plus moral culture came from Europe. but also the African American who came over here, who should have assimilated, also played a critical role in the moral culture. We were the moral conscience of this nation as well. You see, so you know, we created a welfare culture, if you will. And what was the extending circumstances? What I want to ask you that disallowed them, who were our Americans, because we're Americans, we've been here 400 years, not to assimilate the same way others have had the opportunity to assimilate, who maybe have come over on a ship in the 1920s or the 30s to the Liberty thing. So so I just wanted to ask you that assimilation does not always 100% apply to the Black Americans who have been here with dealing with extenuating circumstances that are unique to them than those who have come over here now from.
Okay. The main response I make, you actually almost have said what I would say, and that is what made Blacks and Hispanics different was that they didn't come from Europe. See, the great immigration wave of the progressive era, which is about 100 years ago, almost all those people came from Europe, not Western Europe. They were part of Europe. And the result was that they found it easier to assimilate in the US than they would have if they'd come from a completely non-Western part of the world. But that's where Blacks were coming from. They were coming from the non-West, from indeed the least individualist culture in the whole world. And that's still true today. And now we have some Blacks who immigrate to the United States today and have no problems. That's because they've been thoroughly individualized before they ever come here. They're not typical Africans. And if we took a typical random sample of Africans and brought them to the US, they'd have many of the same problems that our own Black population has when they haven't assimilated. And the same for Hispanics. They also are coming from a non-Western part of the world. And so for them, life is about survival. But that isn't what life in America is about. America is about achievement, personal vision, pursuing one's personal goals. All of that assumes qualities of initiative and focus and capacity for self-command and so on, which we just take for granted, which are not at all normal in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has its own culture, and they have their own way of living, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't fit America. If you come from that background, you're going to have a hard time in this country.
So I would say I see your point, and yes, my ancestors come from not an individualistic culture. They came from a community culture, and that's sometimes indicative within the Black community. However, when you're here for 400 years, you do pick up certain, characteristics or certain principles or certain ways of living from who you've been with for 400 years. So that means that that Black Americans who have been here for 400 years had the opportunities and had the capabilities to embrace the capitalistic culture or the individualistic culture based also on the moral construct that they come from as well. So my question still is, what was their limitations in not being able to assimilate? Was it strictly because of their culture, or was it strictly because of racism?
Well, it's true that as long as there was slavery, and after slavery there was Jim Crow, which is a kind of unofficial form of slavery, as long as that was true, they didn't have the opportunity to move towards mainstream culture. It was after slavery was abolished that Blacks that were able to leave the South, or even if they didn't leave the South, they went to school and they went to church. And both school and church in America are strongly individualizing institutions. Just as you were saying, you need to have, I guess it was actually Gordon Anderson who was saying this, the institutions set a structure, but the individuals have to learn from that what life is supposed to be about. Well, the Black leadership learned exactly that in school and church. And by the early 20th century, they're the ones who were leading the movement against Jim Crow and against the fuller assimilation of Blacks into American society. And then in the 60s, you get the civil rights movement. And those leaders, and also college students who were following them, they're the main reason why Jim Crow was abolished. And it certainly had to be abolished. But then you were left, for many of those who were coming from slavery, they then had no structure. They didn't have an external structure from the outside authority system. And they also hadn't yet internalized the norms in the way the mass of the population does that came from Europe. So, and what stood out about the Black leadership was precisely because they had internalized it. What made them different was exactly because they had taken on board what I call the burdens of freedom. And that's what made them formidable. And they were no longer intimidated by whites and by white Southerners in particular. And they were ready to bear the responsibilities being free citizens. And that is why they triumphed. But then the bulk of blacks still have to make that transition.
I don't want to take it over and I have to go. I have one question for you in this assimilation process and what you're just sharing with me. Say, for instance, why people go on welfare because of the lack of opportunities that are presented to them. Many times opportunities come to you because you can watch examples, you can watch prototypes that that can mentor you even by sight.
Yes.
So when I look at the how many congressmen did we have in 1800s? And my question is, if at that time they were terrorized and not to continue being congressmen. So hypothetically, let's look at it. If they had the opportunity to stay congressmen in the early 1800s, and there were 14 of them, they would have been example setters for all of the masses to see. And maybe we would have a different mentality or mindset
I
the masses of people.
You see, at the point you're talking about in 1810 or whatever, almost all Black America at that point was living in the mind of Africa. They hadn't yet become Americans. And of course, the Southern whites were not about to permit that at the time. And you had to fight a civil war to overthrow the racial system.
Of course, we have an African mind, but I kind of disagree with you on that point. We were able to navigate because we understood the European thinking as well, and we assimilated some of it as well. So as well as they assimilate from us, but I don't think that we were living primitively in our African thinking. That's why we weren't able to assimilate with you or with the American society.
I think that was too early. They needed to go to school and church. That's what made them into Americans in the standard meaning of the word.
Well, I'm saying even if that was true, why was it that those who rose to those occasions that would have been a great example and a great prototype, not only for Black Americans, but for white America and for America itself? Why were they terrorized so much that they had to run away to different states? And then, in this era, we get a couple of congressmen say, oh, these are the first congressmen, Black congressmen, which it was not true. There were prototypes set long time ago.
But you're right that there were some Blacks who lived in the North and who were not subject to slavery. And they did indeed become early exemplars of the Western mentality. That is true. And in fact, a marvelous movie that I recommend to anybody is it's called Glory. It's about the Civil War, about the regiment of Black soldiers created by a white officer. And they absolutely become individualists by becoming soldiers for the Union. And in the end, they're killed in an assault on a Southern fortress. But they show that, and before that, they have to stand up to white people, white Southerners, who disagree with the very idea that they can ever be individualists and citizens like anybody else. And no, they fight, and they fought them, and they beat them. See, that's what it takes to assert yourself.
So in my conclusion, and I'm so sorry, actually, I read some books and did Black history. When Black Africans came over here, they came over here already with a sense of, what is it? the word eludes me. That was very close to the Constitution, natural laws.
I don't believe.
Yeah, they came over already with the sense of that. Then,
this is the Western idea. They hadn't gotten there yet.
I'm reading that we already, if you, 1700s. I didn't know it, and I'll send it to Alan. That those Black Americans who wrote in 1700s, they took the forefathers to court and told them, "You are not living up to those moral standards that you proclaim." I didn't know that they were taking them to court in Boston and stuff. And these are Black Americans.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I think
I'm
we're going
sorry.
to. No, fantastic. I was going to jump in. I realized I was on mute, but no, it was a great discussion. But I guess for this purpose and forum, we have a few minutes left. Gordon, do you have any comments you want to throw in here again as you've been listening to this conversation, or finish what you were suggesting?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't know Zachary's situation. I would have certainly wanted him to go first.
Yeah, I didn't either. So
I was trying to outline a kind of framework in which there are impersonal social institutions and then personal moral agents that make up society. And so the goal of social institutions should then be to help people become moral agents. But one of the problems we have today is our institutions are trying to take control of individuals. That's what you have with the problem on the left. They don't want people to become moral agents. So schools want to control, public schools want to control people, whereas vouchers would serve more the individual finding own moral agency. So giving benefits like just cash, as Lawrence stated, it just doesn't seem to have any positive effect. Whereas I think something like vouchers would create, that would allow moral agency to work in the creation of new people, because you'd be giving it to moral agents, not to institutions. And then another thing is, you use the term individualism, Lawrence, and I think that individualism has to be at least qualified so that it doesn't include moral license. Individualism, it's important to be sovereign individual with autonomy, but the idea of the Constitution is we do no harm to others. And when individuals wander over into that, then you have a problem. So you do have an important role of the institutions in creating the framework so that individuals don't go beyond being constructive moral agents. And the goal of institutions should be to create good moral agents, and the goal of our culture should be to create moral agents. And you need the freedom to do that. So you need freedom on the left, you need a certain amount on the right, and a certain amount of the left wing is correct. You need both, and the right balance.
Let
me just ask one question.
Yeah, thank you.
One question. So one thing that's important for individual autonomy is ownership. And this is in the economic sphere. We talked about the cultural and the political sphere, but in the economic sphere, which is the third sphere, ownership is important so that you can become a moral agent. As Aristotle said, if you don't own a house, you can't host somebody. So communism doesn't want you to own a house. You can't host anybody. What about a welfare to home ownership program rather than rental?
Well, we have a number of housing programs that attempt to do what you're suggesting, to make home ownership possible for low-income people. And what we found is that those programs usually have only a small effect because the people who become homeowners don't have the regular income due to employment that they would need to maintain their mortgages. So
But
it's
what if the housing payments went to mortgage payments that would conditionally be taken over in the future? So
well,
that
in a sense, that's what we have. We have arrangements where the owners don't pay the full amount of the mortgage, or there are various support elements that allow them to maintain the mortgage, even though they're not paying the full cost of it. So in a sense, that's what you're saying. But because the demands are still that you have to have earnings and you have to be working, that's why it's been hard to make those houses generally available. And we have a general housing shortage right now that has many reasons, and I'm not going to go into that. That's really a broader problem. But for poor people, the great difficulty is to have regular employment so that you have regular earnings. And then from there, you can, first of all, rent a house or an apartment, and later on buy a house or an apartment. That's the American way, but it assumes that everyone's involved in the labor force, and that isn't true for many of the low-income population.
I have a question here, if I may just jump in. You mentioned in your bio too, Professor Lawrence, about work programs for men. You've been advocating or suggesting something in that area. Do you want to take a few minutes to describe that?
Yeah,
it's important.
When welfare families form, the mother typically goes on welfare, but the father has disappeared. The father then is supposed to pay child support. He's supposed to help the mother support the children, even though he has left the family. And the child support system is a way in which fathers can be obligated to pay something to support the family. And in my own view, the difficulties getting fathers to work regularly are such that we probably have to create government jobs for them. And then employment has to be enforced for them, as it is also enforced for the mother as part of the welfare reform. So we really have to have what I call welfare reform for men. We have to do for them what we did for the mothers. See, the mothers were made to work, but they also got a sizable subsidy, something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, such that with their earnings, they could then support themselves more nearly and need less welfare, and maybe get off welfare entirely. The men, however, have a much smaller subsidy because they're not in charge of the children. And they themselves have more difficulty working than the mothers, even though the mothers have the difficulty dealing with children and providing childcare and so on. I mean, that's one of the great mysteries in anti-poverty policy, is that why the fathers are usually less employable than the mothers, the opposite of what you might imagine. But that's crucial. We have to get the fathers working, and I would certainly take extreme steps to obligate them to work and then to enforce it. I think they need to be quite clearly told that if you are a father of a child, you owe employment to the child and the mother. And it's only if you do that that the father is going to be able to remain in the family. As I was saying before, a two-parent family is altogether better for the child than a single-parent family. It's become absolutely clear recently that there isn't any way for a government program to offset the absence of the father. He is really irreplaceable. And we have to accept that the father is not leaving the family. The father has to be in there working, contributing, if possible, living with the family, which is what he traditionally did. The father was part of the family.
All right, let me ask one last question, and then we'll just wrap up here because it is top of the hour. So thank you very much for your time. We could have many discussions. This is from Roger Weatherall. He says, many of the African and Hispanics and Asians have very strong family cultures. Is the individualistic, enterprising culture of Europeans necessarily better? And are there other cultural and social models that might be just as good as the American model, such as those they have developed in Korea and Japan?
Asians typically do have stronger families than blacks, and that's a reason why they don't have the serious social problems that we've seen amongst blacks and also Hispanic. But it's not true that Hispanics have a large family tradition. It used to be thought that they were more family oriented than people from European backgrounds, but that really isn't true. In fact, today, about 70% of Black children are born without fathers. For Hispanics, it's about 60%. I'm sorry, 50% or 55% for them, but for people from Puerto Rico, 65%. So the family has collapsed among Hispanics the way it has already collapsed among Blacks, and that is their underlying social problem. And so those fathers too, I would require them to work, and they would have to participate in the family. You can't get away. If you have a child and you used to have a family, you can't just run away. No, you got to stay there and do what the father's supposed to do. And that's essential to the child.
Okay, great. Thank you. Final comments, Dr. Anderson, and then Lawrence.
I have nothing more to say. I think you've been very patient, and I think people are hearing the message. And I thought, frankly, I would encounter more criticism than I have.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for everyone for your attention and robust discussion and good thoughts, supported by, I think, reality. We all believe in strong families, that's for sure. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
See you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.